Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Polk, and the focus is Dark Horse. The year is 1844. It's a presidential election year. The Whigs are in power, but things haven't gone very well. William Henry Harrison had won the election of 1840, but he died 1 month into office. John Tywer, who was really much more of a Democrat than a Whig, had taken over, and he had been fighting with the Whig-controlled Congress almost the entire tenure. So there was going to be a wide open opportunity here. The Whigs, in fact, jettisoned Tywer, and they went back to their original standard bearer, Henry Clay, to put him forward for the third time to try to win the presidency, whereas the Democrats seemed to be leaning toward Martin Van Buren, bringing back the former president to run as the Democrat, and you could have had Van Buren and Clay. The primary topic of conversation at the time was Texas. Texas had become an independent republic. It broke away from Mexico in 1836. Andrew Jackson was president at the time, and he really wanted to bring Texas into the American Union, but he didn't have the votes in Congress, and he didn't have the time inheriting this issue with less than a year to go in his presidency. The only topic really where Martin Van Buren, who was Jackson's handpicked successor, where Van Buren and Jackson really differed was on this topic of Texas. Van Buren, as president, ignored, he put the issue aside because he felt if he went ahead and tried to annex Texas, it meant sure war with Mexico, and he wasn't willing to do that. And so it did lay fundamentally dormant, this topic, during the Van Buren administration. Well, Tywer certainly had brought this back because he was very pro-annexation. In fact, during this election year, 1844, in April, his Secretary of State, John Calhoun, negotiated a treaty of annexation with the Republic of Texas. But the U.S. Senate didn't sign on. It did not get the 2/3 necessary to validate that treaty. So Tywer, as president, still trying other methods, working with the Congress to see if he can get Texas into the American Union on his watch. This is what everyone was talking about. In fact, letters were sent to all of the potential presidential and vice presidential candidates to see where they stood on Texas. James Polk was one of those. His name was in the mix as a potential vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, and he was happy to quickly respond on this topic because he was completely aligned with the Jacksonian Democrats on this issue. Let Texas be re-annexed, he wrote, and the authority and laws of the United States be established and maintained within her limits, as also the Oregon Territory, and let the fixed policy of our government be not to permit Great Britain or any other foreign power to plant a colony or hold dominion over any portion of the people or territory of either, very much in line with the Monroe Doctrine and the Jacksonian view of things. Now, of course, this was a minor element in the public discourse because he was a potential vice presidential candidate. People were focused on, what does Henry Clay think? What did Martin Van Buren think? And as mentioned, Clay came out against Texas annexation, lost certainly some of his support in the South over this, but he still got the Whig nomination. Van Buren did not have to respond to this letter. He could have stayed silent and very likely would have been the Democratic nominee for president. But he chose to answer, and he gave a very fulsome response in a letter to William Hammett, which was intended to be issued publicly, and it was printed, and it came out very strongly with a detailed explanation about why Van Buren was still against annexation of Texas at this time. He was worried about the relationship with Mexico and a few other things, but this really imperiled his candidacy in the eyes of the Democrats. In fact, Polk was with Jackson when they learned of the Hammett letter, and Jackson basically said, both privately and eventually publicly, that his favorite, Martin Van Buren, his handpicked successor, he could no longer support. The Democratic race was a whole new ballgame. Well, Polk had a strategy. He was deciding in the eve of the convention that he was going to still support Van Buren, as long as Van Buren was still a viable candidate for president and continue to position himself for a presidential run as VP. But if Van Buren's candidacy became unviable, then he wanted his supporters to push for the top spot on the ticket. And those supporters really were principally two friends, Cave Johnson and Gideon Pillow, representing Polk. Candidates didn't go to these conventions at the time. They had their representatives there to do their bidding for them. This was going to be a really difficult dance. You don't want to be too aggressive. You don't want to be too passive. You got to pick your right spot. And that was in the hands of Johnson and Pillow. The key vote really in all of this was the vote on the 2/3 rule. This was a rule that the Democrats had established in some of their conventions, not all, but in some, requiring a supermajority to get the nomination for either president or vice president. To get full unanimity, 2/3 votes were required. If the 2/3 rule passed, that was going to make Van Buren's candidacy almost impossible. Van Buren actually, even before the Hammett letter, had locked up a majority of the delegates for first ballot votes at the convention. So if the 2/3 rule was out, he could get, and likely would get, a majority on the first ballot. He would be the nominee. But if the 2/3 rule passed, that was going to make it really hard for Van Buren. And the fact is, the Democrats in the room, including those who were committed to vote for Van Buren in the first ballot, were angry with him. They wanted Texas. And so they voted in favor of the 2/3 rule, and this was going to make it very difficult for Van Buren. Now, Van Buren did open up with a majority on that first ballot, 146 votes, but he was 31 votes shy of the supermajority needed. He was ahead of Lewis Cass, he was ahead of Richard Johnson. They were second and third. And Van Buren only continued to drop after that first ballot as people started to switch their votes. In fact, Cass took over the lead on the 5th ballot. After the 7th ballot, everyone was exhausted. They decided to break for the night, and this was the key moment in the campaign for Polk's supporters. The backroom discussions were underway, very active for Johnson and Pillow, and a key element was historian George Bancroft of Massachusetts, who was thinking at the time, who could unite the Democratic Party in these important cleavages between the North and the South? And Bancroft later told Polk that it flashed on my mind that would be alone safe to rally on you. Bancroft was a key catalyst to get Polk the nomination. He engaged Henry Carroll, another delegate from New Hampshire, to get him on board. And the next day, when the 8th ballot commenced, Polk, out of nowhere, got 44 votes for the nomination for President of the United States. Those votes came from both North and South. The momentum was all his. The final keys were the biggest states, New York and Virginia. They actually, when the 9th ballot commenced, they went offline in their separate caucuses to talk about what to do. When they came back, Virginia went first, was all in for Polk. And New York, which is the home state of Van Buren, eventually even gave way, released their delegates, no longer to support Van Buren, and they all went into Polk's column, and he became the nominee with 231 votes, compared to only 29 for Cass. It was a wild celebration. This was the first time anything like this had happened. A candidate coming completely out of the blue, a compromise candidate emerging at one of these conventions. We'd certainly see many of these in the future, but this was the first time it had happened, and it favored James Polk. They called him a dark horse, and this term of a dark horse candidate, somebody who comes out of nowhere to win a delegate race for the nomination of a major party, this was due to something that New York's Silas Wright said. Many of the delegates wanted Wright to be the VP candidate for Polk. He was a friend of Van Buren's, popular within the party, but Wright didn't want it. He wanted to stay as senator, and he said he did not choose to ride behind on the black pony. This was a phrase that he said, the black pony being this horse coming out from nowhere to run and get the nomination. Black pony became dark horse, and it's been part of our political vernacular ever since. The convention went with George Dallas of Pennsylvania as the VP candidate for Polk. Well, Polk himself was actually in the dark about this for about a week before news finally reached him, and instead of really going into much celebration, he went straight to work. He was all about policy, he was all about campaigning. The Whigs were shocked at this. They were almost ridiculed the Democrats over this selection. They were saying over and over again, who is James K. Polk? Now, James Polk had been the Speaker of the House, been the governor of Tennessee, but he'd never been really a national candidate. And even Henry Clay, his opponent, said, are our Democratic friends serious in the nominations which they have made at Baltimore? He regretted that persons more worthy of a contest with us had not been selected. Again, there was a lot of ridicule. But then the election and the campaign really got underway, and the fact is the Whigs were vulnerable. They were vulnerable over Tywer. They were vulnerable for Clay and his stand on Texas, not popular in the southern part of the country. Now, Polk has already shown that he is an astute political strategist and campaigner, and he decided to make some big moves to enhance his opportunities of beating Henry Clay, put himself in the best position to win. And he had three major obstacles. There were a lot of disappointed Democrats who wanted the nomination and their supporters, and when Polk got it, it was a question whether or not they would get out and support him. His position on the tariff was controversial in some of the northern states, and he had an obstacle in the White House with President John Tywer, and he addressed all of these very strategically. Polk knew he needed all hands on deck from the Democratic population if he was going to be able to beat Clay in this election. So he took a bold move. He did something where he decided to take a single-term pledge. He said that if the nomination made by the convention shall be confirmed by the people, I shall enter upon the discharge of the high and solemn duties of the office with the settled purpose of not being a candidate for re-election. Now, only William Henry Harrison had taken a one-term pledge before, and Harrison was 68 years old at the time. Polk was 48 years old. He was still a young man, but he was going all in for this race. He wanted all the Democrats to align with him, and then he would be out and they could all run again against each other in 48. And this actually worked. The Democrats really did come out and started rallying around Polk, and this one-term pledge really helped. Two of the states that Polk absolutely needed were the biggest ones in the North, New York and Pennsylvania. One of those disappointed Democrats, Martin Van Buren, was a key catalyst for winning New York. He agreed, even though he was personally disappointed, he didn't want the Whigs coming to power, and he was going to work really hard to get Polk elected in his state. In fact, he convinced Silas Wright, who was happy being a senator, to run for governor, really to drive turnout. And Wright didn't want to do this, but Van Buren was continuing, he was incessant, he got Wright to run, and he got that turnout in New York, which was critical. As for Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania cared about the tariff. It was one of the strongest pockets of pro-protective tariffs in the country. So the question is, how would James Polk, who had really been against protective tariffs, get them on board? Now, he was silent on the topic for a while, but in the end, in October of 44, he wrote a public letter, the Kane Letter to John Kane of Philadelphia, very artfully phrased on his position on the tariff. He said, I have heretofore sanctioned such moderate discriminating duties as would produce the amount of revenue needed, and at the same time afford reasonable incidental protection to our home industry. In my judgment, it is the duty of the government to extend as far as it may be practical to do so, by its revenue laws and all other means within its power, fair and just protection to the great interests of the whole Union. So what did all that mean? It was actually pretty vague. He got the word protection in there a couple of times, sounded favorable to it, but was he for it or not? And he refused any further elaboration. He said, that's my letter. And it actually worked, because enough people in Pennsylvania thought, well, protection's in his letter, he must be for it. Well, he wasn't. And in fact, it was another artful comment where it was incidental protection. That was the key word for James Polk in the Kane Letter, because he was really for revenue-only tariffs. If that gave some incidental protection to some industries, that was fine, but he was not going to be in favor of high protective tariffs. But people in Pennsylvania were listening enough that they came on board. He won Pennsylvania by about 2% of the vote. He had won New York by about 1% of the vote. And part of that was to get that third obstacle out of the way. John Tywer, the president. Now, Tywer had been alienated from the Whigs. He certainly wasn't popular in the Democratic circles, but he was pro-Texas and he still had supporters. If he stayed in the race, he was going to take votes away from Polk. And Polk went to Jackson, and Jackson and Tywer had been at odds for a long time. But Jackson wrote a couple of letters that were shown to Tywer that helped convince him, for the good of the future, to make sure the Whigs didn't win and their agenda was going forward. Tywer got out of the race. He agreed to do so after seeing these letters from Jackson. And now he's got those disappointed Democrats supporting him. The tariff issue was put aside enough. Tywer's out of the race. And sure enough, these step-by-step moves made the difference. As mentioned, he won narrowly in New York, narrowly in Pennsylvania. If New York had gone for Clay, Clay would have been president of the United States. But New York stayed in the Democratic column, and Polk won at 170 to 105. He won the popular vote by about 1.5 points. And among the most happy people of all, Andrew Jackson. I thank my God that the Republic is safe and that he had permitted me to live to see it and rejoice. And I can say in the language of Simeon of old, now let thy servant depart in peace. Sure enough, Andrew Jackson would be dead in less than a year, but his Speaker of the House, his dark horse candidate for president, would be the final president in his lifetime when he is inaugurated into office in March of 1845. That is James Polk and Dark Horse from the life of James Polk. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.